Today's passage, along with a parallel passage in Ephesians, is a bit of a Rorschach test. That is, depending on how people read and interpret the passage, often says more about the readers themselves than it does about God and about God's will. I know I've piqued your curiosity now, so let's get right to it. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas. At the end of Colossians chapter 3 and the beginning of Colossians chapter 4, Paul says, "Wives, be subject to your husbands, as is fitting to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, and never treat them harshly. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this is your acceptable duty in the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, or they may lose heart. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, not only while being watched and in order to please them, but wholeheartedly, fearing the Lord. Whatever your task, put yourselves into it, as done for the Lord and not for your masters, since you know that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You serve the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for whatever wrong has been done, and there is no partiality. Masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, for you know that you also have a master in heaven." Unless I miss my guess, you either read this as a direct command from God about how to order human relationships, especially marital relationships, or you read it as a difficult but ultimately dated piece of advice that doesn't apply to us directly. Either way, you probably treated it as a binary choice, either A or B. Furthermore, you probably forgot about the rest of the letter to the Colossians and took it as a standalone passage. But let's take a closer look at how this passage fits into the rest of the letter, and you may be surprised by what Paul is getting at here. So here's what I hope. I hope that in a few minutes, you will be able to let go of your hardened opinion about what this passage means and gain a deeper appreciation of it. To start with, let's just be honest. If we think that Paul is giving eternal commands about husband-wife, parent-child relationships, commands that require wives to be submissive to their husbands, commands that imply that God means for husbands to be superior to their wives, then we quickly run into a huge difficulty. For Paul also says that slaves must obey their earthly masters. If you treat what Paul says about wives and husbands as the final and fixed will of God, and then you say, like nearly every one of us, that slavery has no part in the Christian life, then you have a real problem on your hands. You either have to say that God actually ordains slavery, just as God ordains wives to be submissive to their husbands, or you have to treat the two commands as fundamentally different, but without any real reason why. But what if? What if Paul isn't giving divine eternal decrees about hierarchical relationships? What if Paul is addressing a particular issue in Colossae? What if Paul is giving the church in Colossae advice about how to avoid disintegrating as a community, using the commonly accepted norms of the day? If we have seen anything in Colossians, we have seen how Paul is struggling to keep the little Christian community there together in the face of a new and foreign religious movement that had the effect of fracturing relationships. Remember, the challenge of this new religious movement was that it caused people to search for communion with God apart from a community of faith. It was based on the idea that the material world in which we live is an unfortunate distraction at best and evil at worst. In such a religious environment, you can imagine that human relationships would have become frayed. Some would simply withdraw from relationships as distractions from the quest for communion with God. Others would have treated human urges and desires as irrelevant to the quest for God, and they would have engaged in lustful behavior, believing that, for example, extramarital sex, drunkenness, gluttony, and so forth were irrelevant to the life of faith. Against this sort of background, Paul needed to keep a Christian community together, avoiding the excesses of those around them. One of the ways to keep the community together would have been to encourage people to maintain their traditional relationships. What Paul counsels here isn't some new way of life, but the way of life they already knew. No need to muddy the waters by counseling a new and different way of life when maintaining the integrity of the community would have been difficult enough. The message, in other words, was don't rock the boat, much more than it was a final fixed way of being in relationship. Now, if there is anything new in Paul's advice, and there is, it would have been a degree of reciprocity in relationships that would have been absent in the non-Christian community. What I mean is, in the ancient world, children, for example, weren't the treasured and beloved little creatures that we see, but something more like assets for the family's well-being, performing chores that otherwise remain quiet and subservient. In Paul's community, the revolutionary thing here was taking the relationships that were common to the time and making them relationships in which even the lesser partner would have been treasured and loved, rather than treated as simply a vassal, a servant. What would Paul counsel today? Well, it's simply impossible to know. He's not here. But my strong hunch is that he might write this passage a little differently, placing less emphasis on hierarchy and more emphasis on what we might call mutuality, which is already part of this passage. For ultimately, that's what Christian love aims for. And now may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.